Good afternoon, everyone. So, it's almost 2:10, so we're just going to start. We're supposed to start at 2. So, just going to quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Stephen Eyre. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Imagine Canada. So, my specialty is basically revenue strategies for the nonprofit sector. And
Linda Shohead, Canadian Center for Literacy.
Right. So we're going to start, and just people can file in, and no big deal. So we want to start off with presenting a bunch of data on revenue streams in the literacy subsector of charities. So we're going to start going over the broad overview of where literacy organizations get their revenues, and then talk about which sort of dependencies different types of organizations have. Linda's then going to go through a bunch of the stuff that she's done on revenue, accountability, and tie this together. And then we're going to try to get an open session where if you have any questions you have about the stuff we presented, or we have discussion about particular revenue strategies, how they work, how to make them more effective, anything you'd like to discuss, we'd be more than happy to accommodate. And we are going to just start with this, and hopefully this will provide some launching points to talk about particular topics in more depth. So I just did a very quick analysis looking at the tax records of any organization that identified itself as a literacy organization in Ontario. So there's about 118 that, there's 118 that in 2008 identified themselves as a literacy organization in their tax filings to the Canada Revenue Agency. Of these organizations, 14% of their money came from individual gifts, being so if you're getting a tax receipt on a contribution, 14% came from that source. So another 13% came from transfers from other charities. So if you're getting money from either an operating charity or a foundation, that's what this 13% counts from. The other 33%, or 1/3, came from the provincial government, so Ontario government in this case. 13% came from the federal government, and 4% came from fundraising, which could be a donation where you get a tax receipt, could be corporate money, again, where you get a tax receipt, anything along those categories. That's what this equates to. So you'll notice this does not add up to 100%. There's a whole ton of lines on the tax return about revenue, and I didn't feel like writing them all out. But if anyone has any questions about anything that's not on there, I'm more than happy to address it. There's a little bit of money from membership income, investment income, all that sort of stuff. But this is essentially what Ontario literacy organizations generate for revenue.
Can I ask you, are you talking only about charities?
Yes.
Charities.
So, unfortunately, I don't have access to the nonprofits filings, and there's a little. But yes, it's absolutely just charities. But generally, it's most sectors, charities versus nonprofits. The ratio of revenue is very predisposed to just the charities having greater source of revenue. So, if you actually look, there's a couple different comparisons against what we call the core nonprofit sector. So this is anything that's charities, excluding hospitals and universities. So most of the organizations involved in actual social service type work, which is a pretty good comparator, that's what it's doing. So these are really, you probably can't actually see the numbers, but I'll just basically describe where the major differences are from literacy versus other types of organizations. So you can see for individuals, there's about 50% more money coming from this source than typical in the charitable sector. Particularly one that's really noticeable and different is transfers from other charities. This is particularly from foundation funding. This number is about 4 times as high as other types of organizations. So particularly foundation fundraising seems to be a really effective way to get revenue in this subsector. Now provincial government funding is, write the number down, is 38%. So provincial government provides a pretty typical, it's pretty much the same amount as you'd expect. The federal government does provide quite a bit more to this subsector than other types, so 13 versus 4. So again, it's about 3 times as much. A lot of other charitable organizations get much more from the provincial government, relatively speaking, where the federal government often in different subsectors it doesn't fall within their jurisdiction. And then for fundraising, it's 4% versus 1% typically, so there is much more revenue from fundraising, but it's still really not that big an overall piece of the pie. So the other thing I looked at was we call revenue dependencies. So what source of funding are organizations dependent on? So 63% of organizations in Ontario were dependent on government funding. That could be provincial, federal, municipal, which is really rare, but it could be technically municipal to fall under those government funding. The other one that's really big was gifts and donations. So this could be transfers from other charities or gifts from individuals. So you see this number is 23%. For Ontario literacy organizations, this number is much higher than any other province. So if you look at Quebec, it was about 4%. The average for Canada was about 7%. So this is a sector in Ontario. Literacy organizations are doing much better than literacy organizations in the rest of the provinces, as well as other types of charities in the country. The other one, which is earned income. So this is only 7% of organizations are dependent on this source of revenue. So earned income is a pretty big topic these days, and there's two different types of things you have to know about earned income to really interpret that number. One, you can have earned income for delivering services from the government. In this one, we lump that together. It's earned income from any source other than the government. So if you broke that apart, this number would be much higher, but just from earned income from anything other than getting money from the government, it's relatively small. And there's also several other different ways you can get money. So some people do really emphasize fundraising, other people really emphasize, well, some people have endowments, not many, but there's some. And so there's other sources of funding that can be really dominant for types of organizations and particular organizations. So this is a really broad and relatively quick overview of funding for the literacy sector in Ontario. I did want to pass it back to Linda, and if anyone has any questions about any stuff, I can flip back to the other page or ask anything about what's typical or any suggestions that we might get from this.
Okay, I'm extremely grateful to Stephen for having provided this data to me, because it helps me contextualize a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. There were a few people in the room here today who were in the session we did about the accountability project that we did in the past few years called Connecting the Dots, where we were trying to find out what the impacts of various accountability frameworks in the country actually had on providers and programs across the country. And we had, in that context, we actually hired field researchers, 7 of them across the country, to conduct interviews with both providers and funders. And I think what we found, Stephen, was, as you pointed out, there were huge variations across the country. There actually are some provinces where literacy providers are almost totally dependent on government. They have a very minimal amount coming from other streams, and in many cases, I see Neil Lombrey is here from the OLS. You might have a better idea of what the percentages are, but in some provinces, even what comes from the provincial government is sometimes transferred over from the federal government. So even where the distinction is made here between federal and provincial, sometimes there is federal money that is still called provincial because it comes from some kind of a joint agreement or a shared funding stream that is like the NNBA. Right, like the labor market agreements, okay? And that doesn't necessarily show up here and here. But I think the theme that came through there were multiple themes, but one of them was that in organizations where they did have a number of funders, it actually sometimes increased the burden of accountability on them because they had to be accountable to multiple funders, and they had different frames of reference and had to be reporting in different ways to them. So although it added to their revenue, there was a constant complaint that their reporting requirements and accountability requirements took up an inordinate amount of their time. In some cases, it was varying to 50%. In some cases, there were people who were saying, when it surpasses 50%, we should actually think about shutting down the operation, because if you're spending more than half your time reporting back to your funders, you're not able to provide your services. So that was a huge issue. The other piece, and you pointed it out again, is that this varied dramatically across the country, and how much people got from donors, how much they got from gifts, and how many foundations there were available, because a lot of foundations actually are provincially based. I mean, I know as an organization that when I was based in Quebec, if I had a project and I came to Trillium would say, no, you can't apply to us because Trillium funds Ontario organizations. So we don't have a huge number of organizations in Canada that fund right across the country. People are generally restricted. Depending on what province you live in, you're going to have more or less access to that kind of funding. I guess the final one was the one you were talking about, the earned income. And I don't know what you necessarily put under other. There are a number of programs who actually market products. They develop something, they develop a tool, they develop a work.
The products would be under.
Would that be under earned?
Yeah. Other would
So what
be
would
the
be under?
ones who are, if you have.
No, just, I
I'll turn
don't
around.
know, but.
Actually, other would be, so like you have, someone gave you an endowment and you're
Ah.
going off all the interest.
Okay,
Or if
okay.
you are getting, if you have membership fees, we also consider that.
That's
under
other.
other.
Okay.
Earned income, we don't consider that membership fees. It's kind of a, I mean, semantics really.
So
But-
earned is both your service and your products?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, that part wasn't clear to me. So again, the issue around earned income was that if you're providing fee or marketing product or a tool, it also takes you time to do that work, right? And you have to be constantly worried about the balance. If the service you're providing is not your core service that you're doing through literacy, then you need to be saying, okay, how much of our time is being put into providing the service and generating the funds for us to do what our core mission is. So there was always a concern about mission drift, loss of focus on mandate, et cetera. And I would say those were probably the key issues that came up. The big one, of course, was do we need to be do we need to be dependent on government? And for an awful lot of organizations, at this point, government was the only game in town. And you pointed out that at this point, that's true for most of the voluntary sector.
Yeah.
It's a very, but the voluntary sector also accounts for, isn't it about a third of economic
It's,
activity in the country? It's huge.
it's,
It's huge.
about 7% of
Is that all?
GDP.
Okay.
Depends on the metric you want to use,
Okay.
because if you look at employees, it's about 10, but,
Okay.
and then if you include volunteers, you get a different number.
Okay.
You include, I mean, there's a whole several different ways to measure it, so.
So I mean, I guess what ended up with, the issues that ended up emerging from this point, again, there were multiple issues, and they were complex issues, but it was about whose agenda we were fulfilling, because when you are being given government money, as somebody who worked with us a couple of years ago said, you know, let's just put it squarely on the table. If you are getting all your funding from government, you are an instrument of government. That's it. If you're happy with that and it doesn't conflict with your mandate and your mission, there's no problem. If it does conflict with your mission or mandate, you have a serious problem. And this is something you and your board need to sit down and confront. So these are the kinds of issues that people talked about, you know, being confronted with on a daily basis. And the big one was, could they shift some of this dependency away from government? And at the moment, it doesn't look like that is happening. What the likelihood is, I'm not sure. I mean, we keep talking about marketing. What are we marketing? Or, you know, is this marketing going to generate other kinds of income for us? Or is the marketing just a way of increasing the number of services that we provide that are still going to be dependent on government funding? So that might be all I want to say at this point. I mean, I think those were the big issues that emerged from that piece of research. It was different across the country, but people didn't complain less in Ontario than other places. I want to tell you, I mean, it's quite interesting when we put that up, and I didn't realize how big the difference was, but people in Ontario actually still felt that they didn't have enough diversity in their sources of income, that they were too dependent on government. But I do want to say that in some places, people are 90% dependent on government, and in some places, almost 100. I mean, apart from some membership fees and maybe 5 to 10% of income coming from somewhere else, it's government. So if the government isn't there, they're either not there or they find a dramatically different way of operating.
Well, having presented in pretty much every province and quite a few of the states in the United States, pretty much everyone complains about the same things, regardless of, you can see dramatically different pictures of how the revenue comes from, and they still complain about it. So, particularly like the United States, where they're predominantly funded by individuals, they still complain about the lack of diversity in their revenue streams.
And they have huge numbers of foundations as well.
So it's, I guess, people like to complain no matter what.
I don't know what it is. I mean, that was one of the things that struck us. Despite the huge variations, the themes were common. The themes were common. People had the same things to say. So I don't know if people have questions, because I mean, I'm assuming you've got somebody here who has some tremendous expertise in some of these areas, and probably like Katniss. One of the things is, I talk about is like in-kind support.
Mhm.
So I don't know how